So in this session, we're going to talk about the Situationist International in a way that might seem a little unusual, but hopefully novel, and hopefully in a way that's interesting and that connects to the more canonical ideas that have to do with this group and its strategies. So in essence, I'm going to be arguing that the Situationist International and all the movements that lead up to it, and some of the fellow thinkers of the SI, have something novel to say about human animality. So in other words, about our species being. So species being is a term that is probably most associated with the early Marx, but I'm arguing that the SI is going further in its articulation of what it means to be a human animal, in the context of their works, their ideas, and their strategies. And I should say up front that I don't think that this is something that they were doing purposely or knowingly. I think this is something that we might find in hindsight, and with the benefit of more recent turns in posthumanist theory, in animal studies, in attention to the non-human, and so on and so forth. So I think it's there, but not fully formed and not fully realized in the minds of the Situationists. Aside perhaps from a couple of them, including Asger Jorn, who I think is most explicit in wanting to come to terms with what it means to be a human animal. So at the start, I think we should approach this in a way that we see it as two-pronged, at least. That in the history of the Situationist International and their strategies and their ideas, on the one hand, there's an articulation of animality, which remains by and large founded on traditional stereotypes of animals. So brutes, beasts, beings driven by pure instinct, herd mentality, and all sort of the more baser associations of the history of animalization, which includes the dehumanization through animalization. So we have this negative articulation and understanding of animality, which leads to a number of dangerous analogies in history, something we might want to talk about. But then I think there's something more novel in the way the SI, and I'm going to be saying SI for short because saying Situationist International gets to be a mouthful after a while. But I think the more novel approach of the SI is the positive articulation of animality. So sort of exploding or moving beyond an understanding of animality as simply something that's pejorative, something that's base, something that's simple, or primitive, and what have you. But that they had a positive articulation of animality, which pointed towards a novel understanding of the human being, and of society, especially in relationship to the city, and the spectacle, and possibly resisting the spectacle. So these are all ideas that are very much part and parcel of the SI program, which we're going to talk about when we meet, but we're also going to be talking about it in progress today. And so in many ways, this positive articulation of animality that I think we can find in a fledgling form in the Situationist International matches the ethological breakthroughs that we've had really since the post-war period. Primatology largely starts in the Japanese context. We're not going to be talking about that, but it starts during the post-war period. And all these incredible breakthroughs that we've had in our understanding of non-human animals, which over the past few decades have been astounding, which really break up all the stereotypes we have about animals, and they're almost always more sophisticated and complex than we previously thought. So it's interesting that within the history of what I'm calling Situationist Ethology, ethology is the study of animal behavior, we have, largely unknown to the Situationists, we had at the same time these developments in ethological thinking, and in the counterpoint of ethology, which would be behavioral psychology, and experiments on animal behavior in the lab. These are really picking up steam in the 1950s. and then continuing on to the latter half of the 20th century. So I find it really compelling to sort of think about those two histories in tandem, which they're largely apart from each other, but there are really these interesting affinities between what I'm calling SI, ethology, and actual ethological scientists and behavioral psychologists who are working on animal behavior, really starting in the post-war period. So in dealing with these ideas, and what I'm kind of describing as the disclosure of our species being along the 20th century that we'd never really experienced before, it's important to present some historical context, and I have at least two really large-scale historical references for when and where we're working today. So the first would be, of course, the World War II and the utter devastation, and really in many ways kind of the low point of humanity, with this war, and then probably above all with the genocide of 6 million people in the Holocaust. And so this is in some ways the 0 degree of what's become known as biopolitics. So if you've read Foucault, if you read Giorgio Agamben, Esposito, but especially Agamben, there's this idea that World War II and especially the Holocaust showed how humanity could be reduced to simply bare life. So life that's simply killable, that's simply discardable. So it's a harrowing history, and it's easy to see how this discourse on biopolitics meets with the discourse of animality, because of course in human history, animals are those beings that are deemed to be killable, are deemed to be bare life for the most part. So it's as if with World War II and this devastation, there was a collapse in what it meant to be human and non-human. It's as if certain humans were deemed to be and reduced to killable animals. So this is, again, a harrowing and very difficult history. And this is why, incidentally, just as a parenthetical here, working on this topic can be very dangerous, especially when we're dealing with analogies or affinities between certain humans who have been dehumanized through animalization. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. But going back to the historical context, this, of course, had a major impact on artists, on filmmakers, on thinkers, on philosophers, and obviously on society and the economy and politics as a whole. And in culture and cultural production and in the arts, it was widely, not everywhere, of course, but there were a number of artists who thought that the only thing we could do at this point in human history is to start from scratch. And so this is really encapsulated in this classic neo-realist Italian film by Roberto Rossellini called Germany Year Zero. It's very bleak, and it's set in the ruins of World War II, and it's as if history, it's exhausted and it's sputtering, but it's trying to start back up again, as if like World War II was this just dropping out of history, and all we can do is to start from zero. And you had artists that were also thinking in these terms. So in the domain of painting, Francis Bacon, I think, is one of those painters who's really often evoked with this immediate post-war desolation and really loss of respect and loss of faith in humanity and in humanist history. And so he has a very famous quote with David Sylvester that he does in an interview. I mean, I'll give you the quote right now, and this quote is going to be accompanied by this painting from 1946 called Figure with Meat, a pretty horrifying image, a number of one in Bacon, where a figure is presented to you with carcasses, massive carcasses in relief in the back that are almost like mocking angels' wings or something like that. But of course, that's not at all what they are. They're slabs of flesh. And Bacon has this famous quote about becoming meat, about the human becoming meat. He says, "Of course we are meat. We are potential carcasses. If I go into a butcher shop, I always think it's surprising that I wasn't there instead of the animal." So there are a number of ways in which we can unpack this quote, but I think you can probably tell that we're dealing with a period of incredible bleakness and of understanding and of thinking the human as reducible to something that can be butchered or is potentially meat, which in war that does seem to be often the case. And World War II was a whole bunch of butchery. And so we have Bacon and this really bleak assessment of both human and non-human animality in this painting and in this quote. And then we also have Jean Dubuffet, a French artist. He's also really well known as a painter of the immediate post-war period. This is his The Cow with the Subtle Nose, a painting I've always really admired for reasons I'm not sure why, but it's a really nice painting to me. And Dubuffet's program was exactly what I've just described. For Dubuffet, there was no redeeming quality of the immediate post-war period. He thought that we can only start with what's available at hand, which is mud, which is devastation, which is just the things that are left over from after the war. It's as if we have to start culture all over again. So his paintings are often a bit scatological, there's an element of graffiti. There's also this element of almost cave painting, because he was really making parallels with cave painting, as if we're restarting history all over again, going back to the origins. And again, whatever is on hand. So it seems often in his work, the animal is one of those things that's still at hand to start up again. So Dubuffet is an interesting case here. So within this historical context of the war, we have this on the one hand this understanding of the human as possibly reducible to a non-human animal in all sorts of various ways. And also an understanding of art as starting from scratch, right? From starting from scratch. So this is all important to keep in mind as we're going to move forward to the SI, because the SI, kicks off in the 50s. Officially, it's founded in 1957, though these artists are doing things in the late 40s and early 50s in different groups. And so they too are within this atmosphere, this bleak atmosphere of the immediate post-war period. And these artists will then also take recourse. Again, I don't know yet if it's fully aware or it's simply there to be picked up and they weren't completely avowing it. But the animal plays a central role here. And we're going to see with Asger Jorn, the painter Asger Jorn, it's explicit. And I'll show you examples of that in a moment. And so the other major historical context that we should bring into relief here is the ideological conflict that was the Cold War, which really does start around the same time, or really at the same time, at the end of World War II. Basically, the dropping of the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima kicked off the Cold War, which would last into the early 90s. And in some ways, this ideological conflict continues. And that conflict would be the conflict between capitalism and communism, of which the SI were skeptical of both sides, which is an interesting part of their history. I think they're in many ways early in being disdainful not only of Western liberal capitalism, but also of communism and its totalitarian turn. Specifically most especially with Stalin. And I think this disdain that they had for capitalism and communism connects to their conception of species being. It had something to do with their understanding of what it means to be a human, and a human animal. And so on the one hand, and I'll bring in some ants here, this wonderful image of these red ants, red of course because we're talking about communism. So on the one hand, communism is deemed to be untenable because it envisions human society as a homogeneous totality or a superorganism. And in fact, there was one of the first, and probably the most important of the first cybernetic systems theorists, Norbert Wiener. He writes a book called The Human Use of Human Beings. And he calls this type of state the fascist ant state. So here we have not only a recourse to an analogy with a non-human animal, with ants, and the superorganism that is an ant community, but we also have then a conception of the human that does not fit with the conception of communism. So there's something about what it means to be human that just doesn't work with a state that envisions everyone to be homogeneous. Whether or not that's really what communism aspires to be is an interesting question, but certainly in really existing socialism and in communism during the Cold War, this seems to be one of the sticking points. This bureaucratic control of a homogeneous society, which didn't suit the individuals of that society for various reasons. And so for the SI and for Norbert Wiener, I think it has to do with the idea that what it means to be a human does not work within a setting of a superorganism. But that doesn't mean that capitalism, the opposite ideological terrain of communism, is not also insufficient. And so capitalism and what had yet to be deemed to be neoliberalism are equally untenable as communism, and for the same reason, but for different circumstances. So it's also the case that the societies that are engendered by capitalism, especially free market capitalism, neoliberalism, that leads to privatization and an eroding of the state and of social programs. This too is untenable because that it leads to an atomization of society, an atomization of individuals. Atomization meaning that we're all kept separate from each other. That leads to a pseudo-social or an asocial society, which also doesn't fit with our species being. And so this is one of the earliest translations of Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, where this is the classic text from 1972, where he lays out how it is that media, society, especially visually, leads to a separation of people, even if they come together and watch the same things. And I like the cover because the cover is architectural. You get the sense everybody is in their own compartment, in their own individual unit there. So it's almost like a visualization or a literal visualization of the atomization of society. And so again, this too doesn't work with what it means to be a human animal, because there's something about us from an ethological and evolutionary perspective that we're social. That we need community, we need friendship, we need kindness, we need conviviality, to use that buzzword from participatory art. So for SI, if they're skeptical both of the totalizing effects of communism and the atomizing effects of liberal capitalism, then it seems as if there's something in between. There's something that they think of us as something in between the two. So we're neither a superorganism nor are we solitary earthlings that can live alone, but something in between. And so I think one of my major arguments is that SI ethology, SI species being, is a Marxist socialism that, and maybe for the first time, takes into account the ethological and evolutionary reality of what it means to be a human. And by this, I mean human without any metaphysical baggage of the history of humanism, or the idea that humans or humanity is apart from nature, is apart from other animals, is in some ways metaphysically transcendent to the material world. By this, I really do mean a purely materialist understanding of the human, a neo-Darwinian understanding of the human, which again, I think the SI are the first to attempt it. At least that's my argument with this material. And so I have a triangulation of three terms that I want us to think about, and here are the Situationists. Again, the Situationists were a group. You'll read this from the reading, but there are a number of groups that come together to form the SI. Groups in Italy, groups in Holland, and of course in France. So you have groups like Cobra, you have the Lettrist International, you have the Imaginist Bauhaus. These people all come together to form the SI in 1957 in Italy. And so if we're going to talk about their strategies and their ideas and their existence within the terms that I've laid out, I'd like to think of it as a triangulation of three terms that we could go through. So the first is, again, calling back to behavioral psychology. So very quickly here, the history here is that on the one hand, really beginning in the 1930s, you have the development of ethology, the study of animal behavior, by Konrad Lorenz and Nicholas Tinbergen. And this is the paradigm of studying animals in the wild, what today we would call behavioral ecology. Before this, though, definitely into the 19th century, there was already a tradition of behavioral psychology, which is to take the animal, not observe them in the wild, but take them into a lab and test them and perform certain experiments in a laboratory. So in many ways, ethology and behavioral psychology, though they both work on animal behavior, they're distinct in that sense. One is interested in behaviors unadulterated by an experiment. The other is very much about the experiment and the lab and control. Okay, and so behavioral psychology is very much about control through experimenting, through laboratory, and through confinement. And so there's an interesting way in which we can think of some of the SI activities as a détournement of behavioral psychology. And détournement is, there are a number of different ways in which this tactic could be deployed, but it's in its essence, it's taking something that pre-exists and then turning it on its head, and often using it against itself, or bringing new or different meanings out. And so one of my gambits is that the interest in behaviorism, which if you read texts on SI, if you read the primary documents by Debord and by others, there's a huge interest in behavior. There's a huge interest in understanding how human behavior works. And again, often in urban spaces, often in the city, and within the ideological confines of the spectacle and of a capitalist society in the West. So one of my gambits, or one of my arguments, is that they're actually doing behavioral psychology, but they're turning it on its head, often by morphing it into more of an ethological practice, where they actually go out into the street. They actually go out into the cityscape. And so for this, we have to think of the city, we have to think of modernity and capitalism as an experiment in behavioral psychology and control, which sounds harsh, but there might be something to it, or at least it's interesting. It's an interesting idea to think through. So one of the major preoccupations that the SI have in human behavior and its détournement is the idea that there's something about the post-war period, especially the capitalist organization of the economy, which separates private and public lives, which separates even like the time that we live in. So we have work time and then we have leisure time. And maybe above all, the spectacle, the way in which the media and images and consumer visual culture sort of inundates our minds and conditions us to think in certain ways. And Debout will say actually mediates the spectacle, the images, these actually mediate our social relationships, the way in which we even interface with other human beings. All of this is a form of dehumanization. All of this is a form of domestication of the human in the city, and it's enervating. It's tiring, and it will run you down. And so this is connected to this détournement of behavioral psychology and this idea of the city almost as like an experiment, a laboratory that's gone wrong because it's led to so many enervating symptoms. And there's some wonderful posters. These don't come from the SI, they come from the Atelier Populaire, but they're often talked about in the context of the SI, especially around May 68, because the graffiti from the SI and all the text that's in the city, like Debout, I think one of the first one is he graffitis never work, ne travaille jamais. These posters appeared alongside and are part of that social foment of May 68. And a few of the posters attest to this and invoke this analogy to domestication, to herd mentality, and to animality as part of the protest. So this is a pretty famous one. This is the Retour à la normale, return to normal, showing a group of sheep, all falling in line, all in one row, and kind of going backwards if we're going to be reading from left to right. So this is taking recourse to kind of a trope or a stereotype about animality and the social component of animals. Just as a parenthetical, it's interesting that researchers have now understood that the way in which groups of animals work, it's actually much more complex than just this lemming-like herd mentality, and a lot of animals actually deliberate when they're in groups. There's some researchers that even say there's a form of democratic process in non-human communities and groups, because they deliberate and they vote together. So that's just a fascinating idea. But if we go back to May 68 here and Atelier Populaire, this is definitely not the way they're understanding of animals. This is like just an old understanding of animal as thoughtless herd, right? And then there's this other one, which was actually the title slide of this session, also from the Atelier Populaire. And this one I think is very clear. It says, on vous intoxique, we intoxicate you. There's this sort of opium of the masses kind of vibe to this text. And then you have a human figure who's down on all fours, so in some ways domesticated or animalized. And the component parts of the body are either components of technology and of the spectacle, so radio, television, so on and so forth, but also references to meat. So you have mouton on parts of it. It's as if like these are the choice cuts of the human being, however macabre and grotesque that sounds. We're linking back to Francis Bacon now. But in French, mouton is sheep or lamb, actually. They have one word for it, whereas there's two words in English. And so there's a way in which animalization, domestication, and the media and the spectacle sort of come together in this evocative evocative poster, again in a way that relies on old tropes of animality. So when I began the session, I talked about negative articulations of animality. This is definitely on that side of things, right? And then I also, for sort of the longer version of this is all still fledgling as far as research, but there are really fascinating analogs with researchers at the time, ethologists and behavioral psychologists. This is a zoologist, a British zoologist named Desmond Morris. And this is one of the many examples I could have brought in. He writes a book called The Human Zoo, which comes out in 1969. It's translated into French into 1970. And his thesis in this book is that the city leads to pathologies in the human. Really, his thesis, which is in many ways quite problematic because there actually were human zoos in colonial exhibitions, in Western colonial exhibitions, where human beings were actually displayed literally in zoos in the 19th century all the way up into the first half of the 20th century. So this reference to the human zoo is not without its problems, clearly. And I think his thesis is not without problems, but in many ways he says that the city is a zooification of the human being, which is a type of domestication. And for Desmond Morris, it's actually the desires and needs that are met through the city lead to this domestication, lead to pathology, lead to a lack of excitement, and probably the idea, the term that's most synonymous with what the Situationist International were fighting: boredom. Boredom is the key enemy for the conception of life in the SI, as it is for Desmond Morris. And the city as a site of violence on the human body, on the human psyche, and on society, and as a site of control and enervation. All these things are ideas that that really work together in interesting ways between the SI and between the sort of the contemporary work that's being done in behavioral psychology and in ethology. And in this case, the study of a zoologist. So all this is not without dangers and pitfalls, clearly, but it's a very interesting history. And when this does become a chapter in my book, there's going to be all sorts of ways in which I'm going to weave in the actual experiments that were being done in behavioral psychology with this theorizing of the city as leading to boredom, domestication, and control. So all that is to sort of present the SI alongside these theories and to sort of underscore the way in which this more pejorative, negative understanding of human animality was part of their program. Again, maybe not explicit with every member, but I think it's there, and I think it's interesting to try to see through. So now that we've established the more pejorative, negative articulations of human animality in the SI and some of the ideas that were being expounded at the time, I think the more productive and more interesting take of all this is to try to approach the SI through its positive counter-ethology, so the positive associations it made with animality, and conceiving of the human as an animal, as a positive trait, or something that should be not disavowed but avowed. And one of the key thinkers and artists here would be Asger Jorn, who again from 1948 to I think it ends in 52. He's one of the founders of Cobra. He's a Danish artist, Danish painter. He will then meet up with Debord and become part of the Situationist International in 1957. Because of the way the SI functioned, oftentimes Debord sort of kicked out members that sort of deviated from the line. So this is almost like a cliche about the SI. So Jorn would get kicked out a few years later. Actually, he will resign. Others get expelled. So it's a tumultuous group in many ways. But already as he's working with Cobra, he's establishing his ideas in this post-war period about what it means to be a human animal. And he writes a text that wasn't published. It was found in later on, I think in the late 1980s, but it's a manuscript that we found from 1950 to 51, where he writes about Kafka, Kafka, who has all these wonderful animals throughout all his short stories. He writes about Kafka, and he makes a claim in this text, which I think will become really important. It's already important for his work in Cobra, but I think one of my gambles is that I think this becomes a through line and a really important idea for the situationist understanding of the human animal and of SI ethology, as I'm calling it. And so there's this wonderful quote from towards the latter part of this text on Kafka, where he makes this claim. He says, "The human animal is the key problem of European culture." That might sound really surprising in many ways to say that, especially in 1951. And then he continues. He says, "What is, after all, the reason that Darwin's matter-of-fact account of human origin still to this day can cause offense? Why is there such a great emphasis on convincing the animal of the ape family that calls itself the human that he is not an animal, though even a child can see it, something that's perfectly natural and normal in itself? Why are we, who pass through all the animal stages as fetuses, forced to deny our nature?" And so he's very, in many ways, very forcefully taking a neo-Darwinian tack here and calling on us, calling on his reader to understand themselves and to understand the human as an animal. And it's not as if he really is asking the question, why is this an idea which is not really new in the middle part of the 20th century? Darwin is writing this in the 1860s. Why is this such an offense? Why is this such a difficult idea to accept? The answer to that is huge and relates to the history of humanism, relates to the history of Western religions, and human exceptionalism. But here is an artist in the mid-50s claiming and staking the human animal as the key problem for culture and for his work. So much so that later on in this text he said, "I started dividing artists into two groups, those who are morally for the human animal and those who are against the human animal." So Asger Jorn, one of the key situationists, puts this idea front and center. So he's one of the key figures for situationist ethology. And we see this through his work. There are animals that litter his paintings. This is just one of them, the disquieting duckling from 1959. This is a painting that he would have shown while he was with the SI, part of the modification series, where he would get these very, lowbrow, we would call kitschy paintings from flea markets, very sort of like middle-class, petit bourgeois decorations, and then he would paint over it, often with these really expressive gestural marks, often with figures of animals. So there was a way in which, not unlike Kafka, embracing animality offered something productive, offered a form of resistance, or possibly a form of escape from the current problems and concerns that the artist had. So I'm saying this both in Jorn and in Kafka. So it's an interesting thing to think about, and it certainly hooks up with thinking of the SI ethologically. Another way of thinking about this is less directly, is I think a little less direct as Jorn. Jorn is the more direct in invoking Darwin and human animality. But I think these strategies that come out of early SI, even before SI is a group, with Debord and others. So these strategies of the dérive, of détournement, which we've talked about in psychogeography, I like to think all of these as an ethology of the self that counters social mechanisms of behavioral control. So we were talking a moment ago about thinking of the city and of capitalist society and the spectacle as a form of behavioral control, one from which we can't really extricate ourselves. I don't think that the SI thought that they could somehow extricate themselves. I think the surrealists before then thought that there were ways to escape, either through the so-called primitive non-Western, or through the unconscious and the drives and the dreams in the unconscious. I think the SI are more are less optimistic about leaving it or escaping. It's almost as if I like to think of the SI as experimental subjects that understand that they're in a laboratory, that they're being experimented on, and they can't leave. So what they start to do is they start to muck up with the experiment and the lab itself, and they start to use it in different ways, in ways that sort of bear fruit for creativity, for freedom, and for play, and for all these important terms that we're going to talk about in a moment. So from the reading, you'll know that the dérive was this kind of aimless wandering that Debord and the other situationists would do. So using Paris literally as a place simply to wander, and to not have a sort of pre-programmed set direction. So in some ways, this is a détournement of the city, because I think we've all lived in a city. New York is as city as cities get. And we become aware of how the city works on us, and how it conditions us in many ways. And so to use the city in a different way is in many ways a détournement of the city. And then maybe the most interesting part of all this is then the psychogeography, the psychogeographical analysis that comes of this détournement of the city and of these dérives. Because this is a way in which the situationists could stop and think about the ways in which the city worked on them. And here, not only in mind, not only through ideas, but also through the senses, through affect, through moods. It's almost like a total self-analysis. There's a psychoanalytical aspect to the dérive and to psychogeography. And again, I go one step further in thinking that actually this is a form of self-ethology, a form of understanding oneself within one's habitat, which in this case is the city of Paris. For us, it's New York, and for others, it's various other places. And so normally this would be thought of as anthropology or ethnography or sociology, but all those disciplines in many ways presuppose a humanity or a human that's separate from animality. And if it's true that the SI had an understanding of the human as an animal, as attentive to its own animality, then weirdly enough, anthropology, sociology, and ethnography become subsets of ethology, right? The study of animal behavior. There will be a lot more I'd have to do to establish this. It's something I'm looking forward to doing when I actually write up this chapter. One of the key theorists here, who had a really big influence on the Situationists, especially Debord. They had a brief, tumultuous relationship, theoretical relationship, or philosophical relationship, but also political, is Henri Lefebvre, who's a sociologist, but an idiosyncratic sociologist in many ways. And his understanding of the moment, of life, his understanding of life, probably most famously articulated in his critique of everyday life, had a pretty big influence on the Situationists and their strategies, and even their term constructed situations. The term Situationist International actually comes from wanting to create these situations that would go against boredom, against control, and would lead to more interesting forms of living. Lefebvre was a big influence on them. And his conception of freedom within everyday life is a really interesting one. And this, I'm just going to give you a quote from Mackenzie Wark, who's written a really great text on the SI, where he's kind of giving a quick account of Lefebvre's understanding of freedom. And so he says, freedom is born out of need, and the starting point is a theory of needs. Without the experience of need, there can be no being. Needs are few, desires are many. There is no desire without a need at its core. Need without desire, without play, artifice, luxury, superfluity, is no longer human. I think that's a really evocative way of expressing what it means to be alive. It's an interesting conception of life as based in need and freedom. But you may have noticed as I was reading that quote that there's a slippage between the word being and the word human in this sentence. And again, I would argue that SI, influenced by Lefebvre, embodies this conception of freedom, but this conception of freedom can't be limited to the human. That this conception of freedom also, in many ways, describes non-human animality, which is equally based in desire, in need, in play, in superfluity, and so on and so forth. So there's a way in which even Lefebvre, the sociologist, who I don't think he thinks he's articulating a theory of human animality, though there might be a way of reading him that way, nonetheless is offering this up in interesting ways. And I think the artist, or in this case the architect, who most embodies these ideas and this ambition of life as freedom, as play, as desire, and as need, is Constant, who was briefly part of the SI, most famous for his architectural maquettes, these designs of whole cities that he wanted to design, which would be based on a form of architecture that was movable, that you could play with, that was ludic being the word for playful. So Constant, as an architect, is kind of like he's doing a détournement of architecture itself, of city and of the city and of urban design. So he doesn't want the city to be a place of control. He wants the city to be a place of freedom, movement, variability, chance, playfulness, interactivity, and yes, participation, right? He's definitely going against probably the most influential or important architect, which would be Le Corbusier in France, whose architecture would be described by Constant and the SI as lacking in the possibilities of play, and lacking in an understanding of what it means to live as a human. So this is his famous the Radiant City that he first proposed in 1922. You would have these high-rise buildings, everybody living in sort of modular units. A number of his buildings were built, not this one, but a number of his. This is a whole ambitious reorientation of Paris, which definitely had no hopes of happening. But there were buildings that were built by Le Corbusier that again are. There's a way in which they impose a certain amount of control, or there's a lack of understanding of what it actually means to be human. They're unlivable in this sense, or for these reasons. At least that's something the SI and Constant would would argue. So he's going against this type of architecture, which would be modular, which would be in some ways regimented, which would be based in pure efficiency, modern efficiency. Instead, he wants to envision a city where this goes even beyond like using Paris as a derive, but this is actually to remake Paris, to remake a city into a place where everyone gets to participate, everyone gets to be creative and to play. None of these were realized, of course, but there are all sorts of maquettes and architectural blueprints that are super fascinating to think about and to think through. I also find it fascinating to think about all the ways these type of ideas were in some ways realized, but not by artists, but by different forces in history later on, or in different settings. But that's a whole other conversation. And so Constant was not just Constant. A number of the SI artists and theorists were influenced by Huizinga's text Homo Ludens, which was published, I think, in the late 50s, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe 1959. And here we have a conception of the human as playful, as inherently a ludic figure. So not as a worker, not Homo faber, but Homo ludens, the human as play. And the very first lines of Homo ludens is an interesting one for the context of everything we've been talking about today, and for Constant's New Babylon. And the first line goes like this. He says, "Play is older than culture, for culture, however inadequately defined, always presupposes human society, and animals have not waited for man to teach them their playing." This is a really interesting quote, and this is a really interesting text to read. And I think there are two things to be gleaned for this, or at least two things to be gleaned from this. One is that it's as if he's arguing, and I don't know how Darwinian he is. I imagine he is, but I don't know how much of a separation he's maintaining between humans and animals, or human communities and non-human communities. But it's as if he's saying that there's something prior to culture. There's like a substrate of human society, of culture, and that's play. And the human as a playful, creative being is the substrate for everything else that comes later, which is turning the head, turning humanist history on the head. So the idea in human history is that at some point humans leave behind their animality and become full humans, or become this ideal humanity. This is turning that on its head. It's saying that actually the idea of humanism and human society and human culture is founded on on human animality and the propensity for play and creativity and creation. So that's really interesting. And that certainly hooks up with this idea of SI ethology that we've been trying to track today, this idea of the human animal as a creative counter force to control and to history. So that makes a lot of sense. I also find this fascinating because this is written in 1950. This is written in 1950, and this is before ethologists and animal behavior scientists and behavioral ecologists really understood the importance of play, not in human society, but in non-human communities, in non-human animals. And play is probably one of the most important ideas and modalities of living in the study of non-human animals. Play, we now know, is a form of acculturation. It's a form of learning. When little animals like little wolf cubs play, they're becoming socialized, they're learning. There's a wonderful book by Brian Masumi called What Do Animals Teach Us About Politics, where he goes and shows that play is actually the presupposition, the basis for language. And he uses a wonderful example again of wolf cubs. Wolf cubs who are learning how to interact, learning how to fight, learning how to survive, learning how to live in a pack. So this is all conviviality, sociability, acculturation, so on and so forth. He says that when one wolf cub bites the other, that bite is not quite a bite. It's not a bite in the way that wolf would bite, a prey animal, which would be a serious bite. Masumi says this is a playful bite. This is a bite that is not really a bite. And what's more amazing about this is that for the play to work, and for this socializing and acculturation to work, the wolf that's being bitten, that little cub, has to know and realizes, oh, this isn't a real bite. This is just a play bite. So that bite is coded in such a way that it's basically metaphoric. There's a semiosis, there's a semiotics of the bite, not in text, but in body, in affect. This bite becomes a sign for the two animals that are playing. And this is very beautiful, and it really hooks up and it really syncs with this idea of play as being a foundational role or a foundational part of what it means to be an earthling, of what it means to be a living creature on this planet, human or non-human. So I think in Homo Ludens, this works out. This works in analogous ways, and I think in many of the tactics of the SI, at least that's sort of the gambit of this material. I think all these ideas in some ways connect to each other in interesting ways. Which again, later on, when more research is done and the writing gets done, everything will be more fully articulated and researched. But I hope all this was interesting and sort of makes sense in the context of our studying the SI from a participatory perspective. And so I'll leave you with this question, which I think maybe we'll want to talk about when we get together, though we don't have to, if there are more interesting matters. But the obvious question is, well, what does this have to do with the history of participatory art? Beyond the fact that the Situationist International is often invoked as part of this history. Well, the way I would answer that, and I don't think it's the only answer, I'm interested to hear from others, but I think for me, one of the big reasons why I think this work, this material syncs up and hooks up with the history we're tracing in this class, is I think the SI bring out a feature of us, our species being, our human animality, in a way that's incredibly crucial for us to know. If participatory works work with, engage, and use human subjects, then knowing what a human is seems to be like the most basic and important feature of not only being a participatory artist, but of studying this history. And so I think the SI brings us a little closer into understanding what we are in reality. And again, for me, this is understood ethologically from an evolutionary perspective, that we are one animal among others on this planet. So that knowing this and knowing what that means, and by no means have I fully articulated this in this fledgling session, nonetheless, I think is incredibly important for the history of participatory art. And at no point is it mentioned or really discussed in the literature itself. So if I'm finding it in the SI, it's because I think it is something that needs to be included and talked about in the literature, in this history, to actually know what a human being is beyond the sort of rote, dogmatic, humanist idea of the human. Okay, so we'll leave it there. And as usual, I will give you some of the text that I consulted for this, which doesn't include all the text that I quoted along the way. So there was a lot here. But if you're interested to read more, these are highly recommended.